There is something deeply comforting about the ocean at night. If you have ever stood at a harbour's edge after dark, watching the quiet black water shift and breathe beneath the dock lights, you already understand, in some small and wordless way, why the sea has always been the place where civilizations prove what they are made of. Not on land, where armies march along predictable roads and kings hold court in stone halls, but out there, on the open water, where no wall offers shelter, no hill provides cover, and the only thing standing between a sailor and eternity is the skill of the shipwright who built the hull beneath his feet. Tonight, we are going to travel into that world, the world of sail and cannon, of harbour chains and broadside fire, of admirals who became legends and of ships that carried the ambitions of entire nations across some of the most contested waters the world has ever known. We are going to follow two of the most powerful maritime forces in history as they rose, clashed and reshaped the planet we live on today, England and the Netherlands, two small nations perched on the edge of northwestern Europe, two peoples who looked out across the same grey sea and decided that the ocean was not a barrier, but a road, and that whoever controlled that road controlled everything. This is their story, and it is going to take us a while to tell it properly. So settle in. Let the weight of the day ease off your shoulders. Find a comfortable place to rest and let the images come to you slowly, the way they do when you're drifting between waking and sleep. Not rushing anywhere, not needing to hold on to every detail, just letting the story carry you. We begin not in England and not in the Netherlands, but in a wider world that is, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, just beginning to understand how vast it truly is. The Portuguese have been creeping down the coast of Africa for decades, testing the edge of what Europeans believed was navigable sea, driven by a combination of religious ambition, commercial hunger, and a particular kind of quiet, stubborn courage that is very easy to underestimate until you try to do what they were doing, sailing into unmapped water with instruments that could tell you roughly where you were, but could not promise you what lay ahead. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounds the Cape of Good Hope, and suddenly the Indian Ocean, with all its spice routes and ancient harbours, is not a foreign legend but a destination. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama makes the full journey to India and back, and the world's commercial centre of gravity begins, slowly but unmistakably, to shift. Christopher Columbus, sailing under a Spanish flag in 1492, stumbles across a continent that no European map had ever imagined, and the Spanish Empire, flush with the gold and silver that begin pouring out of the Americas over the following decades, becomes the dominant power of the age, a sprawling, violent, spectacularly wealthy empire that controls more of the world's tradable wealth than any single power in history has controlled before. The Spanish treasure fleets, laden with silver from the mines of Potosi and gold from the valleys of Mexico, sail twice a year across the Atlantic in convoys so large and so well guarded that attacking them directly seems, to most observers of the time, essentially suicidal. Into this world, at the beginning of the 16th century, two nations are looking up from relative obscurity and beginning to consider their options. England is a kingdom of modest size recently emerged from a brutal civil war, the Wars of the Roses, that had consumed most of the previous century's political energy. The first of the Tudor kings, Henry VII, has stabilised the throne through a combination of shrewd diplomacy, careful treasury management, and a ruthless willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened the succession. He is not a glamorous king. The historians of his own time found him rather cold, rather calculating, somewhat cheerless, but he is exactly the kind of king England needs after a century of aristocratic bloodletting. He builds reserves, he pays his debts, he avoids expensive wars whenever possible, and he begins, tentatively, carefully, to think about what England might do with a proper navy. The Netherlands, at this point in history, does not yet exist as an independent nation. What will eventually become the Dutch Republic is currently a collection of provinces in the Low Countries, rich, commercially sophisticated, densely urbanised by the standards of the era, and politically controlled by the Habsburg dynasty, which means, in practical terms, by Spain. The cities of Antwerp, Amsterdam, Bruges, and Ghent are among the most important trading centres in Europe. Flemish weavers produce the finest woolen cloth on the continent. Flemish painters, the so-called early Netherlandish masters, are doing things with light and colour that will not be surpassed for generations. The port of Antwerp in the early 16th century handles roughly half of all northern European maritime trade. There is money here and craft and ambition, but it is all operating within a political structure controlled by others. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what follows. England's maritime ambition comes from a monarch, top-down, shaped by royal will and dynastic competition. The Netherlands' maritime power, when it finally emerges, will come from merchants and sailors, from the bottom up, driven by commercial necessity and a ferocious determination to survive and prosper in the face of the most powerful empire on earth. These two very different origins will shape everything about how these two nations fight, how they trade, how they govern their navies, and ultimately how they compete with each other for the mastery of the seas. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves. Before the rivalry, there has to be capacity. Before the great naval battles of the 17th century, there has to be a long period of accumulation, of ships built and burned and rebuilt, of doctrines formed and abandoned and reformed, of men learning the brutal, unforgiving craft of managing a warship in the North Sea, the Channel, the Baltic, and eventually the far reaches of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. This is where we begin, not at the moment of conflict, but at the moment of becoming. The long, slow process by which two ordinary nations transform themselves into something extraordinary. And it starts, as so many extraordinary things do, with a man who understood that the future was going to belong to whoever could imagine it most clearly, and then build it. Henry VII of England was, by nearly all accounts, a man who valued information over inspiration. He read dispatches rather than making speeches. He preferred accounts and ledgers to tournaments. When John Cabot came to him in 1496 with a proposal to sail westward across the North Atlantic in search of a route to Asia, Henry didn't commission a grand fleet or summon the court to witness a ceremony. He gave Cabot a modest grant, a small crew, and a single ship called the Matthew, and he waited to see what came back. What came back was the coast of Newfoundland, though neither Cabot nor Henry fully understood at the time what they had found, and the quiet realization that the ocean to the west was crossable, which opened possibilities that Henry began to turn over in his careful, systematic mind. But what Henry VII recognized, and began to act upon, was something more fundamental than exploration. He recognized that England's security, England's commercial future, and England's political independence all depended on mastery of the sea, and that mastery of the sea required purpose-built warships, not just merchant vessels pressed into service when war broke out. He founded the first permanent English naval dockyards at Portsmouth and built two of the first purpose-built warships in English history, the Regent and the Sovereign, ships designed from the keel up to fight, not merely to carry cargo. This was not yet a full naval strategy, but it was the first stone laid. It was left to his son, Henry VIII, to build on that foundation with the kind of grandiose, reckless, magnificently expensive enthusiasm that only a young king with a full treasury and an enormous need to prove himself could summon. Henry VIII became king in 1509 at the age of 17, athletic, highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, an accomplished musician, a serious theologian, and possessed of an ego that could fill a cathedral. He wanted England to matter. He wanted England to be feared and admired. He wanted, in the bluntest terms, to be taken seriously by the crowned heads of France and Spain. And he understood as clearly as his father had that this meant having ships. Under Henry VIII, the English navy grew from fewer than 10 royal warships to more than 50. He built the famous Henri Grâce à Dieu, known popularly as the Great Harry, the largest warship afloat when she was launched in 1514, a vessel of staggering ambition and questionable practicality. She carried more than 100 guns, which sounds impressive until you understand that the guns of this period were arranged in a way that made firing them simultaneously potentially more dangerous to the ship than to the enemy. Naval gunnery in the early 16th century was still figuring out how to manage the forces it was trying to generate. And then there is the ship that history remembers above all others from this period, not because she was the greatest triumph of Henry's navy, but because she became its most haunting, most evocative, most mysterious loss. The Mary Rose. She was built between 1509 and 1511, a ship of medium size by the standards of the day, but considered one of the finest warships in Henry's fleet, well armed, well staffed, commanded by experienced officers, and crewed by some of the best sailors England could find. She fought in multiple engagements against France, served as a flagship, and by all accounts performed well. By the time of her final voyage, she had been in service for over 3 decades, rebuilt, modified, updated, her hull deepened to accommodate additional guns. She was, in the summer of 1545, still considered formidable. On the 19th of July, 1545, a French invasion fleet of some 200 ships appeared in the Solent, the strait between the English mainland and the Isle of Wight, and Henry VIII himself watched from the shore as his fleet went out to meet it. The Mary Rose sailed out with the rest, and then, before the engagement had truly begun, something went catastrophically wrong. She heeled, tipped sideways, almost without warning. Water poured through the open gun ports on her lower deck. The weight of her guns, her rigging, and the hundreds of men aboard pulled her over and down with such speed that almost none of her crew could escape. Of the approximately 500 men aboard, fewer than 40 survived. She sank in full view of her king, of her fleet, and of the watching enemy, and she took her secrets with her to the seabed. For 400 years the Mary Rose lay on the bottom of the Solent, slowly buried in silt, slowly forgotten, her location marked only by vague references in old documents and the occasional story passed down among local fishermen. Then, in the 20th century, maritime archaeologists began searching for her systematically. In 1971 she was located. In 1982, in one of the most extraordinary archaeological operations in history, her surviving hull was raised from the seabed and lifted into the air, still containing thousands of artifacts, still holding the bones of her crew, still somehow capable of telling the story of an afternoon in 1545 when England's finest warship went down without a fight. What the Mary Rose and her fate tell us about England's early navy is something worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures a contradiction that runs through the entire story of English sea power in this period. The ships were impressive, the ambition was real. But the understanding of how to actually manage a warship in combat, how to balance firepower with stability, how to develop tactics that would reliably win rather than occasionally spectacularly fail, that understanding was still being painfully, expensively acquired. England in the mid-16th century had a navy. What it did not yet have fully was a naval culture. That would come under Elizabeth I. It would come through a combination of necessity, geography, and the peculiar genius of a handful of men who understood the sea, not as a place to display royal magnificence, but as a working environment that rewarded competence, punished arrogance, and ultimately answered to no king's proclamation. The Elizabethan sea captains, Drake, Hawkins, Frobisher, Raleigh, Grenville, are figures so familiar from the history books that it is easy to underestimate how genuinely strange and new they were. These were not aristocrats given command because of their birth. Many of them came from modest backgrounds, trained from youth as mariners, and rose through a combination of skill, nerve, and an exceptional ability to find profit wherever it might be hidden. John Hawkins, who served as Treasurer of the Navy under Elizabeth, is in many ways more responsible than anyone else for transforming the English warship into the lean, fast, gun-heavy vessel that would eventually come to define English naval power. He stripped away the high fore and aft castles that earlier ships had carried, those towering wooden structures built for soldiers to fight from, inherited from the era when naval battles were essentially land battles conducted on a floating platform. He lowered the superstructure, made the ships more stable and faster, shifted the emphasis from boarding and hand-to-hand fighting to long-range gunnery. The English warship of the 1580s was a different thing from the English warship of the 1540s, more purposeful, more lethal, and better suited to the kind of war England was about to have to fight. Because the Spanish Armada was coming, and when it arrived in the summer of 1588, it would test everything that Elizabeth's navy had built, everything that Hawkins and Drake and their generation had learned, and ultimately settle a question that had been hanging in the European air since Henry VII first commissioned his dockyards. Was England a serious naval power, or merely a nation with expensive wooden ships? While England was building its navy under royal direction, the people who would eventually become the Dutch were engaged in something altogether different and altogether more desperate. They were fighting for their lives. The story of how the Netherlands became a maritime power is inseparable from the story of how the Netherlands became a nation at all, and that story begins in blood, in fire, and in the stubborn, remarkable refusal of a commercially minded, relatively small population to accept the authority of the most powerful empire on earth. The Spanish Netherlands, the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland, and their neighbours, had been part of the Habsburg Empire since the early 16th century. Under the rule of Charles V, who was simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, the arrangement had been uncomfortable, but manageable. Charles had been born in the Low Countries, spoke Flemish as his native language, and understood the commercial culture of the provinces well enough to govern them with something approaching tolerance. His son Philip II was a different matter. Philip II, who became king in 1555, was Spanish through and through, intensely, Catholic, deeply suspicious of anything that smelled of heresy, convinced that the Netherlands' growing Protestant minority represented not merely a theological error, but a political threat to the empire's integrity. The religious persecution he ordered, carried out with particular enthusiasm by his governor, the Duke of Alba, was staggering in its scope and its brutality. Alba established a council, quickly nicknamed the Council of Blood, that tried thousands of suspected heretics and rebels, executed hundreds, and confiscated the property of thousands more. The terror was systematic and methodical, and it achieved exactly the opposite of what Philip had intended. Rather than crushing resistance, Alba's persecution transformed it. What had been scattered, disorganized complaint became coordinated rebellion. The leader of that rebellion was William of Orange, known to history as William the Silent, a man of considerable political skill, genuine religious tolerance, and the ability to hold together an extraordinarily diverse coalition of Protestants, Catholics, moderate aristocrats, and radical city merchants united by nothing except their refusal to be governed the way Philip was governing them. The naval dimension of this rebellion was almost accidental in its origins. The Sea Beggars, a name the rebels adopted with deliberate defiance after a Spanish nobleman dismissed them with the word beggars, were initially little more than a collection of privateers operating out of English ports under letters of marque from William of Orange. They were armed men in small ships, harassing Spanish trade routes and coastal positions wherever they could. More pirates than naval officers in the strict sense of the term. Elizabeth I of England, nervous about Spanish retaliation, expelled them from English harbours in April 1572. Forced to find new harbour, they sailed to the coast of Holland and seized the town of Brill on the 1st of April, a date chosen by nobody in particular but remembered by the Dutch as the beginning of their freedom. The seizure of Brill triggered a series of events that no one had planned, but everyone had been building toward. Town after town in the northern provinces declared for the rebellion. The Sea Beggars, transformed almost overnight from pirates to liberators, controlled the waterways that connected the towns, the canals, the river mouths, the coastal shallows that the heavy Spanish warships could not navigate. The Dutch water geography, which seemed to the Spanish military like a handicap, turned out to be an extraordinary defensive asset. The land was flat and easily flooded. The waterways were shallow and intricate. An army that moved along roads could be stopped, cut off, surrounded. An army that controlled the water could go almost anywhere. The war that followed was one of the longest and most complex in European history. The 80 Years' War, running from 1568 to 1648. But within its first decade, it became clear that the northern provinces, led by Holland and Zeeland, were not going to be reconquered. The southern provinces, what is now Belgium, eventually fell back under Spanish control. But the north held, and as it held, it began to develop the institutions, the commercial networks, and the maritime capacity that would make it, within a single human lifetime, the most economically powerful nation on earth for its size. The founding of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, from its Dutch name Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, in 1602 is one of those events that looks, in retrospect, almost inevitable, but was in truth an extraordinary act of institutional imagination. The VOC was the world's first publicly traded joint stock company, a commercial entity funded not by a king's treasury or a single wealthy patron, but by thousands of investors of varying means who bought shares in the enterprise and received dividends from its profits. It was given a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan, essentially the entire eastern trade, and was authorized to wage war, negotiate treaties, build forts, and govern territories in the company's name. It was, in effect, a sovereign power in commercial clothing. The scale of what the VOC achieved in its first decades is almost difficult to comprehend. Within 20 years of its founding, it had established trading posts in India, in Java, in Japan, in Ceylon, and along the Spice Islands. The chain of Indonesian islands whose nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and mace had been driving European commercial ambitions since the Portuguese first found their way there. It was employing tens of thousands of people, operating hundreds of ships, and generating profits that made the Dutch Republic rich in a way that no northern European nation had ever been rich before. Amsterdam, which had been a modest fishing port at the beginning of the 16th century, became by 1621 one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world, its harbour full of ships, its banks full of money, its streets full of the extraordinary cosmopolitan diversity that comes when a city has made itself the centre of global commerce. And underpinning all of it was the Dutch merchant fleet, and the remarkable ships that composed it. The summer of 1588 arrived in England with the particular atmosphere of a nation bracing for something it had known was coming for years, but still wasn't certain it could survive. Philip II of Spain had been planning the Armada for a long time, not just as an act of military aggression, but as a religious crusade, a statement about the proper ordering of the world, a response to decades of English privateering against his treasure fleets and English support for Dutch rebels, and the execution, in February 1587, of Mary Queen of Scots, which had removed the last Catholic alternative to Elizabeth on the English throne and left, Philip feeling that the time for patience had definitively passed. The fleet he assembled was by any measure extraordinary. 130 ships carrying approximately 8,000 sailors and 19,000 soldiers, laden with provisions for 6 months and equipped with enough guns and powder to fight a sustained campaign. The plan was to sail up the Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Spanish Netherlands, cover his crossing to the English coast, and deliver a force large enough to overwhelm any land resistance England could offer. It was a plan of considerable ambition, and, as events would prove, considerable strategic overextension. Francis Drake, who had spent the previous year doing everything in his power to prevent this invasion, including his famous raid on Cadiz in 1587, in which he sailed directly into the Spanish harbour and burned or captured nearly 40 supply ships, an act of such brazen impudence that it delayed the Armada's departure by a year, had argued consistently that the best defence was an aggressive offence, that England should take the war to Spain rather than wait to receive it. Elizabeth's council, more cautious, more concerned about the cost of maintaining a fleet at sea, had overruled him repeatedly. By the time the Armada appeared off the Lizard Point on July 19, 1588, the English fleet at Plymouth was fighting against both the Spanish and its own supply shortages, the result of the Council's reluctance to commit funds to full readiness before the enemy was actually visible. What followed over the next 2 weeks in the English Channel is one of the most analysed and argued over military campaigns in history. The Spanish formation, a great crescent of ships stretching across several miles of sea, was designed to protect the troop transports at its centre from exactly the kind of hit-and-run attack that the English excelled at. The English, unable to break the formation by direct assault and unwilling to come within boarding range of the larger Spanish ships, harassed its flanks and edges, trying to wear it down, drain its ammunition, pick off stragglers. Neither side was achieving the decisive victory it needed. The crisis came off Gravelines on the 1st and 2nd of August. The English sent fireships, unmanned vessels stuffed with combustible material and set alight, into the Spanish anchorage at Calais under cover of darkness. The psychological effect was greater than the physical damage. The Spanish captains, terrified of fire at sea in the darkness, cut their anchor cables and scattered. The formation broke. The English fleet pressed the attack the next morning in what became the Battle of Gravelines, the most sustained gun battle the Channel had ever seen. The Spanish fought back with real courage and skill, but the English gunnery was more effective, and more importantly, the Spanish were running dangerously low on cannonballs. They had not anticipated a fight of this kind, long-range artillery exchange conducted over hours, and their ammunition supply had been calculated for a different kind of battle. By the end of the day, the Armada was damaged, disorganised, and being pushed north by the wind, and then the weather intervened. The storms that swept the Atlantic through August and September 1588 were catastrophic for the Spanish fleet, which had no choice but to attempt a retreat around the north of Scotland and down the Irish coast. Dozens of ships were wrecked on the Irish coast. Men who survived the wrecking were killed by English troops or by Irish clans, whose cooperation the English had secured. Of the 130 ships that had left Spain, perhaps 60 returned, and many of those were so badly damaged as to be effectively useless. Philip II is reported to have said, upon receiving the news, that he had sent his fleet to fight against men, not against the storms of God. The defeat of the Armada did not end the war with Spain, which limped on inconclusively for another 16 years. It did not make England the dominant naval power. That was a gradual achievement, not a sudden one. But it did something perhaps more important. It created a story. It gave the English a narrative about themselves and the sea, a narrative in which the fleet and the sea and the Protestant God and the English sailor were all allied against the forces of continental Catholic tyranny, in which England's insularity was not a limitation but a strength, in which the Channel was not merely a geographical feature but a national destiny. That narrative would be retold and reinterpreted for centuries. It would shape decisions made by admirals and politicians and kings long after every ship of 1588 had rotted away. It became part of how England understood itself, and understanding how England understood itself is essential to understanding everything that comes next. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, in the Republic that was still fighting its own war for survival, a different kind of story was being written. A story not about national mythology, but about commercial calculation, institutional innovation, and the extraordinary things that happen when you give a nation of practical seaborne merchants the freedom to solve their own problems. To understand why the Dutch Republic became, in the early 17th century, the dominant maritime power in the world, you have to understand something about herring. This seems like an odd place to start when discussing global commercial empire. Herring are not exotic, not glamorous, not the kind of commodity that drives historical imagination. But herring is where it begins, because herring is where the Dutch began. The North Sea herring fishery was, in the late medieval period, one of the most valuable commercial enterprises in northern Europe. The shoals of herring that gathered in the North Sea and the Baltic each summer were vast, reliable, and in enormous demand, because herring, salted and preserved in barrels, was the primary source of protein for much of Europe's peasant population during the long weeks of Lenten fast when meat was forbidden. Control of the herring trade meant control of a food supply, which meant a form of economic leverage that was both commercially profitable and strategically significant. The Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of German and Baltic cities, had dominated this trade for generations. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Dutch fishing fleet, based primarily out of the towns of Holland and Zeeland, began to compete with it, and eventually to displace it. The reason was partly technological. A Dutch fisherman named Willem Buykelszoon is credited, around the late 14th century, with developing an improved method of gutting and salting herring at sea, rather than waiting until the catch was brought to shore. This meant the Dutch herring buses, the large specialised fishing vessels they developed for the purpose, could stay at sea for weeks at a time, catching and preserving enormous quantities of fish before returning to port, while their competitors were forced to race back to shore with their catches before the fish spoiled. This single innovation created an industry. By the early 17th century, the Dutch herring fleet numbered in the hundreds of vessels, employing tens of thousands of men, and generating a volume of trade that underwrote much of the Dutch Republic's commercial infrastructure. The income from herring paid for the ships, the harbours, the navigation schools, the insurance markets, and the banking institutions that would eventually make Amsterdam the financial capital of the world. The herring fleet was, in effect, the training ground for the greatest merchant marine in history. The ships the Dutch built for this trade, and for the general cargo trade that grew alongside it, were a revelation in naval architecture. The Vloot, developed in the late 16th century, was a vessel of extraordinary commercial efficiency. It was designed with a single purpose in mind: to carry the maximum possible cargo with the minimum possible crew. Its hull was wide and relatively shallow, excellent for maximising cargo volume. Its rigging was designed to be operated by a small number of men, reducing the wage bill that represented the largest single operating cost for any long-distance merchant voyage. The toll levied on ships passing through the Danish Sound, the narrow strait connecting the North Sea to the Baltic, was calculated based on a ship's deck width rather than its hold capacity, so the Fleet was built with a narrow deck and a bulging hull below it, neatly exploiting this bureaucratic quirk to carry more while paying less. The result was a merchant fleet of unparalleled efficiency. Dutch ships could carry cargo cheaper than anyone else, because they were built better for the purpose and crewed more economically. This efficiency translated into lower freight rates, which attracted more trade, which funded more ships, which reinforced the efficiency advantage in a commercial feedback loop that left other nations struggling to compete. By the 1620s and 1630s, Dutch ships carried an estimated half to two-thirds of all northern European maritime trade, a market share so dominant that the English, watching from across the North Sea, found it simultaneously impressive and deeply alarming. And the trading empire was not merely northern European. The VOC was operating across Asia with a ruthless commercial aggression that makes modern multinational corporations look rather gentle by comparison. In the Spice Islands, VOC agents and soldiers suppressed local resistance with violence that could be, and was, genuinely shocking even by the standards of the time. The Banda Islands massacre of 1621, in which VOC forces under Jan Pieterszoon Cohen killed or enslaved the vast majority of the island's nutmeg-growing population, is one of the darker entries in a business history that contains many dark pages. But understood in its own terms, it was the expression of a simple commercial logic. The VOC had a monopoly to protect, and it was prepared to use whatever force necessary to protect it. Alongside the VOC, the Dutch West India Company, the WIC, was operating in the Atlantic, challenging Spanish and Portuguese dominance in the Americas and the African trade. Dutch traders were present on the coast of Brazil, in the Caribbean, on the coast of West Africa, in the Hudson River Valley of North America. The city that would eventually become New York was, in the 1620s, the Dutch trading post of New Amsterdam, a small but strategically significant settlement at the mouth of the river that Henry Hudson, sailing for the VOC, had explored in 1609. The navigational culture that supported all of this was itself a remarkable achievement. The Dutch Republic invested in geographical knowledge in a way that no previous society had, producing maps and charts and atlases of a quality and accuracy that were without parallel. Joan Bleau's Atlas Mare, published in 1662, was the largest and most expensive book ever printed at that time, 11 volumes containing 600 pages of maps covering the entire known world, sold to wealthy collectors across Europe for prices that reflected both the beauty of the work and the commercial intelligence it represented. Knowledge, for the Dutch, was not merely learning, it was competitive advantage, and it was treated accordingly. It was into this world of Dutch commercial dominance, comfortable, prosperous, globally oriented, and deeply convinced of its own competence, that the first serious English challenge arrived, and it arrived not with a fleet or a battle, but with a piece of legislation. On the 9th of October, 1651, the English Parliament passed the Navigation Act. It was, on the surface, a piece of commercial regulation, 400 words of legal prose setting out rules about which ships could carry goods to England and its colonies. But behind those 400 words was an act of deliberate economic aggression that the Dutch understood immediately for what it was. The Navigation Act stipulated that goods imported into England had to be carried either in English ships or in ships belonging to the country where the goods originated. The target was obvious and unmistakable: the Dutch carrying trade, which had built its dominance precisely on the ability to carry other nations' goods between other nations' ports at competitive rates. Under the Navigation Act, a Dutch ship carrying French wine to England was suddenly illegal. A Dutch ship carrying Baltic timber to English shipyards, timber the English Navy desperately needed, was suddenly prohibited. The Dutch, who had been acting as the general carriers of European commerce for 2 generations, found themselves legislated out of the most important market in Northern Europe. The Netherlands could not simply absorb this blow. Its entire commercial structure was built on carrying trade. It did not have the agricultural surplus to survive on domestic consumption. Its cities required food imported from the Baltic, raw materials imported from Scandinavia, colonial goods imported from Asia and the Americas. Remove the income from carrying trade, and the commercial system that sustained those imports began to unravel. The Navigation Act was not merely an economic inconvenience. It was, from a Dutch perspective, an existential threat. War came in May 1652, triggered not by a formal declaration, but by a confrontation at sea between the Dutch Admiral Maarten Tromp and an English squadron commanded by Robert Blake. The details of who fired first and why remain disputed. Each side had its own account, and each account was shaped by its own national interests. What is clear is that within weeks, the two nations were in a state of full naval war, and that the fight that followed would determine something important about the nature of sea power itself. Maarten Tromp was 63 years old when the First Anglo-Dutch War began, and he had been at sea for most of his life. He had first gone to sea as a cabin boy at the age of 9, had been captured by Barbary pirates and held in slavery for 2 years before escaping, had risen through the Dutch naval ranks through a combination of seamanship, tactical intelligence, and the kind of practical authority that comes to a man who has spent decades actually doing the work rather than studying it from shore. He was, by the time of the war with England, widely regarded as the finest fleet commander in Europe, a man who understood both the technical demands of managing large formations of sailing ships and the human demands of keeping a fleet of independent-minded Dutch captains pointed in the same direction. Robert Blake, his English opposite number, was if anything an even more unlikely naval commander. Blake had been a land soldier for most of his career, a parliamentary general in the Civil War who had never commanded a warship when he was appointed general at sea, a title that reflected the army's influence over England's new Commonwealth government in 1649. What he lacked in seamanship he compensated for with organisational talent, physical courage, and an ability to learn under pressure that was frankly extraordinary. Within 2 years of his appointment, he had become a genuinely competent fleet commander. Within 5, he was considered by many observers to be as capable at sea as he had been on land. The First Anglo-Dutch War produced a series of fleet engagements that were, collectively, the most intense sustained naval warfare the world had yet seen. Both sides were learning as they fought, learning what formations worked, what range was optimal for their guns, how to coordinate the movements of dozens of ships in the chaos of a fleet action. The English, influenced by Blake's military background, developed the line of battle tactic earlier and more consistently than the Dutch, the practice of sailing in a long single file, each ship directly behind the other, so that all the guns on one broadside could be brought to bear on the enemy simultaneously. This tactic, which would dominate naval warfare for the next 2 centuries, was particularly suited to the English approach. Disciplined, coordinated, prioritising firepower over individual initiative. The Dutch fought differently. Their captains tended toward individual judgment and aggression, a style born of the privateer tradition that had characterised Dutch naval beginnings in the Seebeggar era. Tromp was brilliant at managing this energy, but he could not always channel it as consistently as a more rigidly disciplined fleet command might have done. In individual ship-to-ship engagements, Dutch seamanship was often superior. In fleet-level coordinated action, the English line of battle gradually proved more effective. The war ended in April 1654 with the Treaty of Westminster, which required the Dutch to accept modified versions of the Navigation Act and acknowledge certain English claims to respect in English waters. The Dutch had not been defeated. They had fought the English to something close to a standoff, and several of the major battles had been Dutch victories, but the commercial damage of 2 years of naval war had been severe, and the Dutch commercial establishment, which ultimately drove the Republic's foreign policy, concluded that the terms of peace were preferable to continued fighting. Tromp had died in battle off Scheveningen in August 1653, shot by a musket ball, and his death had removed from the Dutch fleet the one commander who might have turned the war's final balance. But the peace was fragile, the underlying commercial conflicts were unresolved, and both nations were already thinking about the next round. The years between the First and Second Wars, roughly 1654 to 1665, were years of competitive tension masked by outward diplomacy. England, under the Restoration monarchy of Charles II, who had returned from exile in 1660 to reclaim his father's throne, was rebuilding its naval ambitions along lines that were both more commercially sophisticated and more explicitly dynastic than the Commonwealth had managed. The Dutch were expanding their commercial empire, maintaining their fleet, and watching English intentions with an anxiety that the Navigation Act and the First War had done nothing to diminish. The immediate cause of the Second Anglo-Dutch War was, like many historical casus belli, a combination of specific incident and long-accumulated grievance. In 1664, an English naval force seized the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam on the Hudson River, renaming it New York in honour of the Duke of York, Charles II's brother and the future James II. The Dutch protested. The English declined to be particularly concerned by the protests. Trade disputes in West Africa and competing claims in the East Indies added to the friction. By the spring of 1665, both sides had found it easier to fight than to negotiate, and the Second Anglo-Dutch War had begun. The English started well. The Battle of Lowestoft in June 1665 was a significant English victory. The Duke of York, in command of the fleet, managed to break the Dutch line and inflict serious losses. There was a moment in the summer of 1665 when it seemed possible that England might achieve what the First War had failed to produce, a decisive defeat of Dutch sea power. Michiel de Ruyter prevented this from happening. De Ruyter was, and remains, the most celebrated admiral in Dutch history, a man whose career trajectory was, if anything, even more improbable than Tromp's. He had been born into poverty in Flushing in 1607, the son of a rope maker, had gone to sea as a boy, had worked his way up through the merchant trade to become a successful captain and ship owner before the Dutch Navy drew him back into service. He was unassuming in appearance and manner. Contemporaries consistently described him as modest, plain-spoken, genuinely warm with his men, but on the quarterdeck he was a commander of extraordinary tactical intelligence and physical calm under pressure. De Ruyter rebuilt the Dutch fleet after Lowestoft with an energy and competence that was remarkable. By the summer of 1666 he was ready to take the fight back to the English, and what followed was the 4 Days' Battle. 4 days in June 1666 fought in the North Sea off the English coast that remains to this day the longest fleet action in the history of naval warfare. We will return to the 4 Days' Battle in more detail, but first we need to follow the Second War to its extraordinary conclusion, because the conclusion of the Second Anglo-Dutch War contains one of the most audacious single acts in naval history: the raid on the Medway. By 1667, England was in financial trouble. Charles II's government had miscalculated its revenue projections, the cost of maintaining the fleet at sea had proved ruinous, and the Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London in 1666 had further strained public finances to the point of near collapse. Unable to fund a full naval campaign, Charles took the extraordinary and ultimately disastrous decision to lay up most of his heavy warships at Chatham in the Medway estuary, protected by a great chain stretched across the river and a fleet of guard vessels. Peace negotiations had begun at Breda. The English assumed they were safe. Michiel de Ruyter did not assume the same thing. In June 1667, he led a Dutch fleet up the Thames estuary, broke the Medway chain with a combination of fireships and direct assault, sailed his warships into the very heart of England's premier naval base, and proceeded to burn or capture the most powerful ships in the Royal Navy at their moorings. The Royal Charles, the flagship, the finest warship in the fleet, bearing the personal coat of arms of the English monarch, was seized intact and towed back to the Netherlands. The Dutch burned several other first-rate ships and withdrew in good order, having suffered relatively modest casualties. The raid on the Medway was not merely a military disaster for England. It was a public humiliation of staggering proportions. Samuel Pepys, who as clerk of the Acts of the Navy Board was intimately involved in the administrative chaos that followed, wrote in his diary about the bells he could hear from shore, which turned out not to be church bells but the sound of the Dutch celebrating. The English court, which had been laughing and dancing while the fleet lay idle, was suddenly confronted with the reality of what financial carelessness and strategic complacency had produced. Charles II, characteristically, managed to present an outward face of composure, but the political damage was severe and lasting. The Treaty of Breda, signed shortly afterward, gave the Dutch almost everything they had wanted. The Navigation Act was modified in Dutch favour. Most of the territorial gains of the war were returned. The Dutch kept New York only briefly before eventually trading it back to the English in the next peace settlement, a fact that has given New York's Dutch origins a somewhat melancholy quality. But in the immediate aftermath of Medway, the Dutch had won what was, by any measure, a decisive victory. De Ruyter, returning home to a hero's welcome, had done something that no admiral before him had done. He had carried the war directly to the enemy's home waters and struck at the very symbol of royal power. He would do it again. The 4 Days Battle of June 1666 deserves its own extended consideration because it is one of those events that looks, from the outside, like a simple military engagement but turns out, on closer examination, to be a window into everything that was complicated, fascinating, and ultimately tragic about this rivalry. The battle began on the 11th of June, 1666, in the waters of the North Sea off the North Foreland of Kent. The English fleet, under General George Monk, another former land soldier who had become one of England's most capable naval commanders, was at a significant disadvantage from the start. A portion of the English fleet had been detached on a wild goose chase toward the French coast, based on faulty intelligence about French intervention in the war. Monk, knowing he was outnumbered but characteristically unwilling to avoid a fight, decided to engage anyway. De Ruyter commanded the Dutch fleet, 84 ships to Monk's 56, and he proceeded with a methodical, intelligent aggression that drove the English backward through the first day of battle. The fighting was savage. Ships were set ablaze and sank. Men were killed in quantities that were terrible even by the bloody standards of the age. The English flagship, the Prince Royal, ran aground and was surrounded by Dutch ships. Her captain surrendered, and de Ruyter had the humiliation of accepting the surrender of the finest ship in the English fleet before the battle was even 2 days old. By the third day, Monk had been forced to retreat, burning his most damaged ships to prevent capture, fighting a rearguard action that was more about survival than tactics. The absent English squadron, finally recalled from its French misadventure, arrived on the third day and allowed Monk to turn and fight again on the fourth. But the damage was too great. The English lost more than 20 ships killed or captured. The Dutch lost fewer than 7. By every measure of the battle, it was one of the most decisive naval victories of the 17th century, and it was de Ruyter's masterpiece. That it did not end the Second War on Dutch terms, that the war continued and eventually produced the Medway Raid as its defining moment, tells us something important about the relationship between tactical victory and strategic outcome. De Ruyter had won the 4 days battle brilliantly, but the Dutch commercial establishment's desire for a negotiated peace, and the English court's ability to keep the war going through diplomacy and borrowing, meant that military victory at sea did not automatically translate into political resolution on land. The Third Anglo-Dutch War, which began in 1672 and represents in many ways the most morally complex chapter of this entire story, was not really England's war at all in the way the first two had been. Charles II, perpetually short of money and increasingly aligned with French policy through a secret treaty, found himself fighting alongside Louis XIV's France against the Dutch Republic in what amounted to a coordinated assault designed to break the Republic entirely. The French army invaded overland. The English fleet attacked by sea. The Republic came closer to destruction in 1672 than at any point in its history, the so-called Ramp Year, the disaster year, when French forces occupied much of the country and William III of Orange, the Republic's most capable military leader, was elevated to effective dictatorship in a desperate attempt to organise resistance. De Ruyter, now in his mid-60s, spent the Third War fighting a defensive naval campaign of extraordinary skill and courage against an Anglo-French fleet substantially larger than his own. The Battle of Solebay in May 1672, fought off the Suffolk coast in conditions of smoke and confusion so dense that ships on both sides fired on their own allies, ended without a decisive result but succeeded in preventing the English from landing the army they had hoped to deploy in support of the French invasion. De Ruyter, outnumbered, fought the combined fleet to a standstill and bought the Republic the time it needed. But behind the English fleet's participation in this war lay a political arrangement that was, even by the cynical standards of 17th century politics, spectacularly sordid. The Treaty of Dover, signed secretly between Charles II and Louis XIV in 1670, had committed England to joining France in attacking the Dutch Republic in exchange for French subsidies that would free Charles from his dependence on Parliament. The treaty also contained a secret clause in which Charles promised to announce his conversion to Catholicism at some unspecified future date, in exchange for additional French support. When Parliament eventually learned years later the extent to which Charles had subordinated English policy to French direction, the political consequences were severe and contributed directly to the tensions that would eventually produce the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Third War ended in 1674, with England withdrawing from the conflict under parliamentary pressure that Charles could no longer resist. The Dutch Republic miraculously had survived the Rampjaar. French forces were eventually pushed back. William III emerged from the crisis with his authority consolidated and his ambitions expanded, and Michiel de Ruyter, who had spent 2 years of the war fighting off enemies on both sides of the North Sea, was sent south in 1676 to command an Allied fleet against the French in the Mediterranean, where he died of wounds received in battle off Syracuse in April 1676, 69 years old, a ropemaker's son who had become the greatest admiral of his age, killed within sight of the land where Archimedes had once solved the problems of physics with the same quiet, practical ingenuity that de Ruyter had brought to the problems of war. We have met them now in the context of battles and wars, but the men who commanded these fleets deserve their own slower, more personal consideration, because they were not merely symbols of national power, but human beings whose lives illuminate the world they move through in ways that the battle reports and treaty texts cannot. Michiel de Ruyter. The name has a particular quality in Dutch memory. Not the ringing, legendary quality of a Drake or a Nelson in English memory, but something quieter, warmer, more domestic. There are paintings of him in the great museums of Amsterdam and The Hague, and in most of them he looks less like a conquering hero than like what he was, a working sailor who happened to be very good at his job. The portrait by Ferdinand Bol, painted in 1667, shows a broad-faced, slightly heavy-set man in his early 60s, dressed with restraint, looking at the viewer with an expression that suggests neither vanity nor false modesty, but rather the steady, evaluating attention of a man who has spent his life assessing situations and deciding what to do about them. There are none of the theatrical poses that characterize portraits of aristocratic commanders. He stands as a man who knows exactly who he is and has no need of performance to prove it. His personal diaries and letters, which survive in reasonable quantity, are consistent with this impression. He wrote frequently to his family when at sea, to his wife, to his children, to his grandchildren in his later years, with an affection and warmth that sits somewhat incongruously with the image of a man who could direct a fleet in a 4-day battle without losing his composure. He was, apparently, genuinely funny in private conversation, with a dry humour that his contemporaries noted with something like relief. War is made more bearable by commanders who can laugh. He was deeply Protestant in a sincere rather than performative way, reading his Bible regularly, praying before battle, attributing victory to God's grace rather than his own genius, with a consistency that suggests genuine belief rather than tactical piety. His relationship with his men was one of the defining characteristics of his command. In an era when the gap between officers and common sailors was enormous and brutally enforced, de Ruyter maintained a quality of accessibility that was genuinely unusual. He knew his sailors by name, not all of them, which would have been impossible in a fleet of thousands, but enough of them to make the point. He visited the wounded after engagements. He argued on behalf of sailors' pay arrears with the Dutch admiralties, which chronically underfunded their navy, with a persistence that made him both beloved by the men and somewhat inconvenient for the administrators. His sailors called him beste grandfather, or more loosely the old man, with an affection that was earned rather than performed. Robert Blake offers an interesting contrast. He was, in many ways, the more intellectually formidable of the two great first-generation Anglo-Dutch War commanders, a man of broader political and strategic vision, someone who understood the relationship between naval power and commercial policy in a way that de Ruyter, for all his genius in battle, may not have engaged with as systematically. Blake had been a member of Parliament before the Civil War, had commanded sieges as well as fleets, had thought about the purpose of sea power in national terms that went beyond the immediate tactical situation. His most enduring contribution to naval history may be the set of fighting instructions he issued to the English fleet, detailed written orders specifying how ships should behave in various tactical situations, what formations to adopt, what signals meant, what to do when the signals could not be seen through the smoke and chaos of battle. These instructions were not his invention in isolation, but he refined and systematized them in ways that profoundly influenced English and later British naval doctrine for the next century and a half. They embodied a philosophy of sea power that valued discipline and coordination over individual initiative, a philosophy that would produce both the great victories and the occasional great rigidities of British naval command. Blake died at sea in August 1657, as his flagship was entering Plymouth Harbour, apparently of heart failure. He was 58 years old, had been in poor health for years, and had refused to leave his command despite his doctor's urgent advice to do so. He was given a state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey, an extraordinary honour for a man born a merchant's son in Somerset, without title or aristocratic connection. His body was later disinterred and thrown into a common pit during the Restoration, which tells you something about the political temperature of 1660. But his professional legacy was not disturbed by this posthumous indignity. The fighting instructions survived the change of government and continued to shape English naval practice regardless of who sat on the throne. George Monk, who commanded the English fleet in the 4 Days' Battle, and who is probably the most underappreciated figure in this entire story, was a man of a different kind of genius. Monk had been a royalist soldier in the Civil War, had been captured by Parliament, had eventually shifted his allegiance to the Commonwealth, and had served it with a loyalty that complicated his later reputation. He was one of the principal architects of the Restoration. It was Monk's army, marching south from Scotland in 1660, that made the political situation that allowed Charles II to return from exile. He was rewarded with the title of Duke of Albemarle and served as one of the commanders of the fleet in both the Second and Third Wars. His performance in the 4 Days' Battle, where he engaged the Dutch with a fleet he knew was inferior in numbers, and proceeded to fight for 4 days against the greatest admiral of the age, is considered by many naval historians to represent the outer limit of what professional courage and determination can achieve against unfavourable odds. He lost. He lost badly, by any statistical measure, but the manner of his fighting, the discipline he maintained, the way he managed the retreat on the 3rd day, and the way he turned to fight again when the reinforcements arrived, all of this suggests a commander of the First Order, someone who understood that defeat managed well could preserve an institution's ability to fight again. There were other remarkable figures in both fleets. Cornelis Tromp, the son of Maarten, who became one of the Dutch Navy's most capable commanders, while maintaining a rivalry with de Ruyter that was the subject of considerable political controversy in the Republic. The English Admiral Richard Deane, who was killed by a cannonball beside Robert Blake at the Battle of the Gabbard in 1653, a death so sudden and unexpected that Blake reportedly held his coat in front of the body for several minutes so the crew would not see what had happened and lose heart. The Dutch Admiral Witte de With, famously difficult to work with, famously brave in battle, whose relationship with his superiors was a sustained drama of mutual irritation and professional respect. But perhaps the most significant figure in the entire story, for the understanding of what this rivalry ultimately produced, is the one who appears not as a military commander but as a political pivot point, William III of Orange, the man who was simultaneously the saviour of the Dutch Republic and the instrument of England's final transformation. To appreciate what these men were actually doing when they fought their great sea battles, it helps to understand the physical reality of the warships they commanded, and the extraordinary, dangerous, technically demanding environment in which those ships were operated. A first-rate ship of the line in the 1660s and 1670s was, by any measure, one of the most complex artefacts that human civilization had yet produced. It was also one of the most expensive. Building a first-rate, a ship carrying 100 or more guns on 3 gun decks, required thousands of mature oak trees, the labour of hundreds of skilled craftsmen over months or years, vast quantities of iron, rope, canvas, tar, copper, and a dozen other materials, and the administrative coordination to assemble all of it in the right place at the right time. The Royal Charles, which de Ruyter captured at Chatham, represented years of labour and a capital investment equivalent to a substantial fraction of the annual revenue of a modest-sized English county. The ship herself, and ships were always feminine in this era, by universal maritime convention, was a structure of extraordinary organic complexity. From keel to masthead she measured perhaps 180 feet. Her main gun deck carried 30 or more 18 or 24-pound cannon on each side, guns capable of throwing an iron ball the size of a small melon at ranges of a quarter mile or more, with enough force to penetrate 2 feet of oak at close range. 3 decks of guns, firing together in a full broadside, produced a simultaneous discharge of perhaps 2,000 pounds of iron, accompanied by a noise described by eyewitnesses as more like an explosion than any sound they had previously encountered, and a cloud of smoke dense enough to make the nearby sea temporarily invisible. Managing this weapon in battle required not merely courage, but a specific kind of technical competence that could only be developed over years of practice. The gun crews, typically 6 to 8 men per cannon, had to load, aim, and fire their weapons in the darkness and chaos of the lower gun decks, often waist-deep in powder smoke, often with the sounds of men dying around them, often with the ship pitching in the sea in ways that made the timing of the shot a matter of experience and instinct rather than calculation. The rate of fire a well-trained crew could achieve, perhaps one aimed shot every 4 to 5 minutes, seems slow by later standards, but the logistical challenge of maintaining even that rate through hours of battle, with powder and shot being hauled up from the magazine in an endless, dangerous relay, was enormous. The English approach to naval gunnery emphasised sustained long-range fire from the line of battle, the formation in which ships sailed in a single file, each vessel maintaining position relative to those ahead and behind it, so that all the broadsides on one side could be brought to bear simultaneously on the enemy fleet. This formation was both a tactical choice and an expression of a particular philosophy, the belief that disciplined, coordinated firepower, delivered consistently over time, would overcome any individual act of heroism or seamanship. It required exactly the kind of institutional organisation and written doctrine that Blake had developed. Clear orders, clear signals, clear penalties for breaking formation without authorisation. The Dutch approach was different. Dutch captains, particularly in the earlier wars, tended toward a more aggressive, individualistic style that prioritised closing with the enemy for boarding. This was partly a reflection of training. The Dutch naval tradition came from a merchant and privateer background where individual ship-to-ship fighting was the norm. It was also partly a reflection of ship design. Dutch ships built to navigate the shallow coastal waters of the North Sea, and the Dutch estuaries tended to have shallower drafts and lighter construction than English warships, which meant they were sometimes less suitable for the sustained pounding of long-range gun battles. Dutch guns were often lighter than their English equivalents, and the Dutch tradition of saving gunpowder, a legacy of the VOC's commercial emphasis on cost efficiency, meant that Dutch gunnery practice was less extensive than English, with corresponding effects on crew skill. These differences in approach had consequences in battle. The English line of battle, when it held together and was properly managed, was a formidable instrument of coordinated destruction. When it broke down, through individual captains ignoring signals, through smoke and confusion disrupting communication, through the kind of opportunistic individual action that the Dutch tradition encouraged, the English system became as much a hindrance as a help, tying commanders to formations they could no longer see, and orders that were no longer relevant. The Dutch, with less rigid formation discipline, were often more tactically flexible in response to developing situations. De Ruyter, in particular, had an exceptional ability to read a battle as it evolved and adjust his dispositions in real time, a quality that Blake's fighting instructions did not really have a framework for, because the instructions were built around the assumption that the battle would proceed in an orderly way that allowed for the signals to be seen and obeyed. Real battles rarely proceeded that way, as every admiral who ever fought one discovered. The broader context of naval technology in this period is worth pausing over, because it shapes everything about how these battles were fought and why they ended as they did. The 17th century is the age of what historians call the sailing ship of the line, the period between the development of the broadside armed warship in the early 16th century and the introduction of steam power in the 19th, during which naval warfare was dominated by the great three-masted sailing warships that we associate so strongly with the era. Within this period, the ship technology was relatively stable. There were improvements in hull design, in gun founding, in rigging, but the basic parameters of what a warship was and how it fought changed relatively little between the 1650s and the 1800s. What changed more rapidly was the understanding of how to use these ships tactically, and the organisational infrastructure, the dockyards, the supply chains, the officer training systems, the administrative institutions, that determined whether a fleet could be maintained in the field at all. The English Navy Board, reformed under Samuel Pepys's meticulous administration during the 1660s and 1670s, became progressively more effective at managing the logistical demands of fleet warfare. The Dutch Admiralty system, divided among 5 separate Admiralty boards representing different regional interests, was structurally less unified and consequently less efficient, a limitation that became more significant as wars became longer and more expensive. The cannon themselves, the principal instruments of naval decision, deserve a moment of attention because they represent one of the crucial differentiators between the English and Dutch approaches. English first-rates of the 1670s carried guns in calibers ranging from 9-pounders on the upper decks to 32-pounders on the lower, and the logistical challenge of supplying a fleet action with adequate ammunition was itself a limiting factor in battle. The famous instance of the Dutch Armada in the First War running short of cannonballs during the very battle where they most needed them is a recurring theme in the history of this period. Navies consistently found that battles consumed ammunition faster than anyone had planned for, and that the side that ran out first was the side that lost. There is a certain magnificent irony in the fact that the long Anglo-Dutch rivalry, the 3 wars, the commercial conflict, the decades of competitive tension, ended not with one side permanently defeating the other, but with the 2 nations effectively merging, their interests united, under the leadership of the man who had, more than anyone else, defended the Dutch Republic against both English aggression and French invasion. William III of Orange was born in 1650, 8 days after the death of his father William II in circumstances of considerable political crisis. He grew up without a father in a republic that was deeply ambivalent about the power of the Orange family. The stadtholders, the hereditary military leaders of the republic, occupied a peculiar constitutional position that was neither monarch nor mere general, and the powerful regent class of Holland had spent decades trying to limit their authority. William's early life was shaped by this ambivalence, by the loneliness of a fatherless childhood in a politically hostile environment, and by the physical frailty that would characterize his entire life. He was small, perpetually asthmatic, with a cough that his doctors worried about throughout his adult years, and he survived to his 50s as much, through will as through constitution. He was a man of few personal warmth, austere, reserved, not given to the easy social charm that characterized many of the great political figures of his age. His biographers have consistently struggled with him, finding a subject who is historically important but personally difficult to like. What he had in compensation was an intellect of rare clarity, a strategic vision that consistently saw further than his contemporaries, and a physical courage that was entirely undeniable. He led cavalry charges in person. He remained on deck during naval battles when most admirals would have retreated to below the waterline, and he showed, throughout his life, a willingness to accept personal danger that went beyond mere calculation and into something that looks very much like genuine indifference to his own survival. By 1688, his position as ruler of the Dutch Republic, he had become stadthouder in the crisis year of 1672, gave him the platform from which he had been defending it against French encroachment for 16 years. Louis XIV's ambitions, once directed at the Dutch Republic, had shifted to a broader European context, but the threat to Dutch commercial and political survival remained. England under James II, who had succeeded his brother Charles II in 1685, was increasingly aligned with France through James's Catholicism and his political sympathies, and was threatening to become a client state of Louis XIV in ways that would have been strategically catastrophic for the Dutch. William's solution to this problem was, in its simplicity and its audacity, almost breathtaking. He would invade England. The enterprise required everything that the Dutch Republic's commercial wealth and maritime capacity could provide. William assembled a fleet of some 500 ships, the largest fleet the Dutch had ever put to sea, vastly larger than the Spanish Armada of 1588, carrying an army of 15,000 men, equipped with artillery, cavalry, and the logistical support necessary for a sustained campaign. The loading and dispatch of this fleet, accomplished in October and November 1688, under the constant risk of intervention by an English fleet that James II had positioned to intercept it, was a masterpiece of the Dutch organisational genius that the VOC had been training for decades. A Protestant wind blowing from the east first kept William in harbour and then shifted to carry him down the channel past the English fleet, which could not tack against it to intercept. He landed at Brixham on the 5th of November 1688. The date was deliberately chosen for its Protestant resonance. Guy Fawkes' Night, the anniversary of the Gunpowder Plot. Within weeks, James II's army had dissolved around him, as officer after officer defected to William's cause. James fled to France, William entered London, and the political settlement that followed, the Glorious Revolution, the Bill of Rights, the constitutional monarchy, transformed England's political institutions in ways whose consequences are still visible today. For our story, the irony is complete and exquisite. 3 wars fought between England and the Dutch Republic, hundreds of ships sunk, tens of thousands of men killed, fortunes spent and lost, and the outcome was that the man who had fought the English in the Third War as the defender of Dutch liberty became the King of England, brought his Dutch financial institutions with him, founded the Bank of England on the Amsterdam model, introduced Dutch methods of public finance that funded the British state for the next century, and united 2 commercial maritime empires under a single political roof. The rivalry did not end with victory or defeat. It ended with something stranger and more consequential, with a merger. The Dutch Republic never fully recovered from the wars and from the financial strain of the Rampjaar period. The VOC continued to operate for another century but began a long, slow decline. The Dutch merchant marine remained significant but gradually lost its dominance to English competition. Amsterdam remained a great city and a great financial centre, but the centre of gravity of Northern European commercial and maritime power began, through the 18th century, to shift definitively toward London. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, channeled the capital-mobilising genius of Dutch finance into English imperial ambition, producing an entity, the British Empire, that would eventually dwarf anything either nation had individually achieved. And underneath all of this, underneath the politics and the commerce and the naval strategy, was the extraordinary energy that had driven both nations from the beginning, the energy of people who had grown up beside the sea, who had learned to navigate its moods and its dangers, who had built their entire civilizations around its possibilities, and who had discovered, through competition and conflict and finally through a strange kind of union, that the sea was large enough to have made them both great. We have travelled a long way from Henry VII's quiet dockyards at Portsmouth, from the sea beggar's desperate seizure of Brill, from the smoke and fire of the 4 days' battle. Now comes the question that has underlain everything from the beginning. When you hold England and the Netherlands against each other, measure them in the scales of maritime power, which one was stronger? The answer, like most honest answers to complex historical questions, is that it depends entirely on when you ask, and it depends on what you mean by strength. In terms of commercial maritime dominance, the Dutch Republic was unquestionably stronger through the middle decades of the 17th century, roughly from 1610 to 1670, than England was at any equivalent period. The sheer scale of Dutch merchant shipping, the reach of the VOC network, the sophistication of Dutch commercial and financial institutions, the quality of Dutch ship design, the depth of Dutch navigational knowledge, all of these represented a form of maritime power that England could not match, and that no other nation on earth came close to approaching. At its peak, the Dutch merchant fleet numbered somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 vessels, more than the merchant fleets of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire combined. Amsterdam was the most important trading city in the world. The Dutch guilder was the most trusted currency in Europe. Dutch insurance markets set premiums for voyages to every port on earth. This was not merely commercial success, it was a kind of soft power of extraordinary scope and depth. In terms of warships and naval combat power, the balance was closer and shifted over time. The English Navy in the period of the First Anglo-Dutch War, 1652 to 1654, was, arguably, more consistently effective in fleet action than the Dutch, for reasons we have explored. Better line of battle discipline, heavier guns, the influence of Robert Blake's organisational genius. The Dutch won several of the individual battles. Tromp's performance in the 4 days against Blake at Dungeness in November 1652 was a tactical masterpiece, but the English showed a greater ability to learn from defeat and to maintain fleet discipline even under adverse conditions. By the Second War, the gap had narrowed. De Ruyter had reorganised and retrained the Dutch fleet with meticulous professionalism, and the result was the 4 days battle, a 4-day engagement in which he outfought and outmanoeuvred the English commander George Monk, under conditions that were as close to the full test of comparative naval capability as the 17th century produced. The 4 days battle was, on any objective assessment, a Dutch victory of the first order. And the Medway raid that followed it, the seizure of the Royal Charles, the burning of English ships at their moorings in their own harbour, was not just a military achievement but a demonstration that the Dutch, possessed both the strategic vision and the operational capability to carry the war to the most protected harbour in England and win. The Third War muddies the picture because it was fought under conditions that made a fair comparison almost impossible. De Ruyter was defending against a combined Anglo-French fleet that substantially outnumbered him, fighting a series of engagements in which preventing the enemy from achieving its objectives counted as success. That he prevented 3 determined Anglo-French attempts to land an army on the Dutch coast in 1672 and 1673, while fighting in circumstances where a single serious defeat would have been catastrophic, is a remarkable achievement. But it tells us more about de Ruyter's genius than it does about comparative Dutch and English naval strength. What makes the question genuinely fascinating is that the two nations' maritime power was built on such different foundations that they were never quite competing in the same way. England's naval power was, from the beginning, primarily military, a state instrument, funded by the Crown, organised for war. The Dutch naval power was, at its core, commercial, an expression of a trading empire's need to protect its routes, funded by merchants, organised as much for deterrence as for combat. When the Dutch had to fight all-out wars at sea, they were converting a commercial system into a military one, and the conversion was always imperfect and always costly. When the English had to maintain a commercial empire, they were reaching beyond what their military naval tradition naturally produced, toward the kind of institutional commercial sophistication that the Dutch had built organically over generations. The resolution of this tension, the Glorious Revolution, and the financial revolution that followed it, produced something that was, in a genuine sense, greater than either nation had been separately. The British Empire of the 18th century was built on the combination of English naval military power and Dutch commercial financial innovation. The Bank of England mobilised capital through public debt instruments modelled on Dutch practice. The East India Company, the English rival to the VOC, eventually surpassed its Dutch counterpart using methods and institutions that drew heavily on Dutch example. The City of London became, in the course of the 18th century, what Amsterdam had been in the 17th, the financial capital of the world. But none of this diminishes what the Dutch Republic achieved in its golden century. It was a republic of fewer than 2 million people, smaller in population than many individual English counties, that dominated global trade, produced an artistic tradition of extraordinary richness in Rembrandt and Vermeer and Hals, developed financial institutions and commercial practices that shaped the modern economy, built a maritime empire that stretched from Java to Brazil to New York, and maintained its independence against the military pressure of the most powerful states in Europe. The VOC alone, at its peak, was richer than most European kingdoms. The Dutch Golden Age was not merely impressive in relative terms, it was one of the most concentrated explosions of human commercial and cultural energy in recorded history. England's naval achievement was different but equally extraordinary in its own terms. The tradition of seamanship and naval organisation that ran from Henry VIII's dockyards through the Armada campaign, through the 3 Anglo-Dutch Wars, through the Caribbean campaigns and the Mediterranean operations of the Commonwealth period. This tradition built an institutional capacity for naval warfare that would sustain British sea power for 300 years. The Royal Navy that defeated the French and Spanish at Trafalgar in 1805 was the direct institutional descendant of the navy that Blake and Monk had commanded in the 1650s and 1660s. The fighting instructions, the dockyard organisation, the officer training systems, the culture of discipline and professional pride, all of it had roots in the 17th century, in the crucible of the 3 Anglo-Dutch Wars. There is a moment in the late 17th century that captures, perhaps better than any other, the strange intimacy that underlay this rivalry. In 1667, after the Medway raid, the Dutch brought the captured Royal Charles back to the Netherlands and put it on display in a harbour where Dutch citizens could come and examine it. They had taken England's finest warship, the symbol of royal power, and turned it into a tourist attraction. They charged admission. They printed commemorative engravings. They sold those engravings across the Netherlands and presumably to foreign visitors. It was, in its way, a magnificent piece of public relations, proof of Dutch naval superiority made tangible and visible and commercially exploited in the most Dutch way imaginable. The Royal Charles eventually rotted in a Dutch harbour, too expensive to maintain and no longer serving any military purpose. But the carved escutcheon from her stern, the elaborate heraldic decoration bearing the royal arms of England, was preserved and it is still preserved today in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where you can see it if you go. It is a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, gilded and painted, the lions and crowns of England's heraldry executed with the kind of meticulous skill that the best craftsmen of the 17th century brought to everything they made, and it sits there in a Dutch museum, having travelled in the most unexpected way from an English shipyard to a Dutch battlefield, to a Dutch harbour to the institution where Dutch history keeps its most treasured things, as a quiet reminder that the boundary between rivalry and kinship is not always as clear as the battle reports suggest. Both nations looked at the same grey water and saw their future in it. Both sent their sons out onto that water in ships built with everything their civilizations could produce. Both created, through the effort and the conflict and the eventually reluctant cooperation, something that neither could have created alone. The question of who was stronger, England or the Netherlands, is ultimately less interesting than the question of what their rivalry made. What it made was the modern world. The navigation laws and the commercial competition drove innovation in shipbuilding and in finance. The wars proved, through terrible empirical testing, which naval tactics worked and which did not. The Glorious Revolution brought Dutch commercial sophistication to English imperial ambition and produced the engine that drove the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire and the global commercial order that followed from both. Neither de Ruyter nor Blake, standing on their respective quarterdecks in the smoke of the North Sea, was thinking about any of this. They were thinking about the wind direction, the enemy's position, the state of their ammunition, and the men under their command. But what they were building through the disciplined application of courage and competence to the specific problems in front of them was larger than either of them could see. There is no way to fully appreciate the naval rivalry between England and the Dutch Republic without spending some time in the city that was, for most of the 17th century, the beating commercial heart of the Western world. Amsterdam in 1650 was something that had never quite existed before in human history, and would never quite exist again in the same form. A city built almost entirely by merchants, for merchants, governed by merchants, whose streets and canals and counting houses represented the most concentrated accumulation of commercial intelligence and financial sophistication that the world had produced. The city had grown with extraordinary speed from its origins as a small fishing settlement on the IJ River. In 1500, Amsterdam had perhaps 10,000 inhabitants. By 1650, it had more than 200,000, making it one of the 5 largest cities in Europe and by far the largest city in the northern Netherlands. This growth was not the product of royal decree or aristocratic investment, but of commerce, the almost inexhaustible capacity of the Dutch trading system to attract goods, capital, and people from every corner of the known world, and to process them through the networks of the Amsterdam Exchange with an efficiency that merchants from Lisbon to Constantinople found simultaneously admirable and infuriating. The physical form of the city expressed its commercial character with a directness that was characteristically Dutch. The Great Canal Ring, the Grachtengordel, that still defines the historic centre of Amsterdam today, was built in the first decades of the 17th century as a deliberate infrastructure investment, expanding the city outward in 3 great arcs to accommodate the population growth that commercial success had generated. The canal houses that lined these waterways, narrow-fronted, tall, with characteristic stepped or neck gables, equipped with hoist beams projecting from their facades for lifting goods to upper-floor storage, were working buildings as much as they were homes, their ground floors often serving as warehouses or counting rooms, their upper floors as living quarters for the merchant family and its servants. The Herengracht, the grandest of the 3 main canals, was where the most successful merchants built their houses, and the houses they built were statements of a particular kind of wealth, not the ostentatious display that a French aristocrat or an English lord might have favoured, but a restrained, quality-conscious opulence that expressed good taste rather than power. The furniture inside these houses was commissioned from the finest craftsmen in Europe. The paintings on the walls were commissioned from the finest painters in Europe, most of whom in the 17th century happened to live in the Netherlands. The libraries contained the most advanced scientific and commercial literature available. The cellars held wines from Bordeaux and the Rhine. The kitchens prepared food from spices that had arrived in ships the owner himself had sent to Java and Ceylon. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Beurs, designed by Hendrik de Keyser and opened in 1611, was the world's first formal stock exchange in the modern sense, a place where shares in the VOC and the WIC could be bought and sold, where futures contracts on commodity prices could be traded, where insurance policies on voyages to every known destination could be underwritten. The financial instruments developed here, short selling, options contracts, corporate bonds, modern insurance premiums calculated on actuarial data, were inventions of staggering long-term consequence. The derivatives markets of the 21st century can trace their institutional ancestry, with reasonable directness, to the Amsterdam Beur of the 1610s and 1620s. The grain trade that ran through Amsterdam was the foundation of everything else, what the Dutch called the moeder negotier, the mother trade, the trade on which all other trades depended. Ships loaded with Baltic grain arrived in the Amsterdam harbour in their hundreds each spring and summer, the harvest of Poland and Prussia and the German interior arriving in a flood that the Amsterdam trading houses processed, stored in the great granaries that lined the harbour, and redistributed across Europe according to where prices were highest. When harvests failed in Spain or in France, it was often Dutch grain merchants who had the reserves to meet the shortfall, and who charged accordingly. This control of basic food supply gave Amsterdam a form of commercial leverage that went beyond mere trading profit into something that affected the political stability of entire nations. The harbour itself was a spectacle that attracted visitors from across Europe. Travellers who had seen Venice or Genoa, cities with their own famous harbours, wrote of Amsterdam's port with a superlative quality that suggests genuine astonishment. The Texel Roads, the anchorage just outside the harbour bar, might hold hundreds of ships at any given time, their masts creating a forest-like silhouette visible from miles away across the flat Dutch landscape. The noise and activity of the dockside, the creak of loading equipment, the shouts of dock workers in a dozen languages, the smell of tar and salt and coffee and spices, was intense and constant and somehow organised, the apparent chaos resolving on closer inspection into a highly efficient system of unloading, warehousing, processing and reloading that had been refined over generations. The men who directed this system from their counting houses on the Herengracht and the Keizersgracht were a remarkable social type. Not aristocrats, not intellectuals in the formal sense, but a class of practical, highly educated commercial professionals who understood mathematics and navigation and contract law and market psychology with the same depth that a later generation might understand technology or finance. They spoke multiple languages as a matter of professional necessity. They travelled to the places where their business took them, to London, to Hamburg, to Lisbon, to the factory towns of the Levant, and they brought back not just goods but information, the kind of market intelligence that translated directly into competitive advantage. Peter Delacour, who wrote his famous political economy text The Interest of Holland in the 1660s, articulated what all these merchants understood intuitively, that the Netherlands' survival depended on maintaining its commercial competitiveness, that military adventures were expensive luxuries, and that the Republic's best interest lay in free trade, legal predictability, and religious tolerance. Religious tolerance was, in this context, not merely a humanitarian virtue, but a commercial strategy. Amsterdam's willingness to accept merchants and skilled workers of any faith, Sephardic Jews expelled from Iberia, Huguenots fleeing French persecution, Lutherans and Mennonites and Remonstrants, and even the occasional Catholic from the southern Netherlands, gave it access to commercial networks and specialised skills that more religiously exclusive cities could not match. The Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam brought with them the commercial contacts and the diamond trading expertise and the network of family connections stretching from Amsterdam to Lisbon to Smyrna to Curaçao that made them extraordinarily valuable to the wider Amsterdam trading system. The Huguenots brought textile skills, and later, after Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 drove many of them to the Netherlands, they brought with them the technical knowledge that would help maintain Dutch industrial competitiveness against the growing English challenge. Rembrandt van Rijn, whose studio was on the Breestraat in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, painted this world with a depth and honesty that no other artist quite matched. His portraits of Amsterdam merchants and their wives are not flattering in the conventional sense. They do not soften features or add nobility to expressions. They show people as they actually were, intelligent, slightly worried, aware of their own mortality, possessing of a dignity that comes not from birth, but from work and judgment. The night watch, his great group portrait of a civic militia company, captures the animation and confidence of a society that has created something worth defending and knows it. His later self-portraits, painted as his fortunes declined and his commercial failures accumulated, show a man looking at himself with the same unsparing honesty he brought to everyone else. Not tragic exactly, but profoundly aware of the gap between aspiration and achievement. This was the civilization that the Dutch were fighting to protect in the 3 Anglo-Dutch Wars. Not just a commercial system, not just a trade network, but a way of organizing human life that had produced genuine beauty, genuine intellectual achievement, and a quality of civic culture that contemporaries from other nations found both attractive and somewhat alien. They had built something rare, and they were going to spend the next half-century defending it against opponents who were, in different ways, both smaller and larger than themselves. England's rivalry with the Netherlands was not, at bottom, purely military or diplomatic. It was driven by a commercial envy that was tinged with both admiration and resentment, the particular emotion of a nation that sees a neighbour doing something better than it can and determines to catch up by whatever means are available. The English merchant class, by the mid-17th century, was a significant and increasingly self-conscious political force. The great merchants of the City of London, the merchant adventurers, the Levant Company, the East India Company, the Guinea Company, had been building their commercial networks through the 16th and early 17th centuries, but they were operating in an environment that was, in institutional terms, substantially less sophisticated than Amsterdam's. English commercial law was more cumbersome. English financial instruments were less developed. English insurance markets were thinner and more expensive. The London Exchange, founded in 1571 by Thomas Gresham on a Dutch model, Gresham had spent years in Antwerp and understood clearly what made the Dutch commercial system superior, was a step in the right direction. But London in 1600 was still a considerably less efficient commercial city than Amsterdam. What the English had, and what the Dutch sometimes underestimated, was an extraordinary capacity for institutional learning and adaptation. The Navigation Acts were one expression of this, a deliberate policy intervention designed to force the development of English carrying capacity by removing Dutch competition from the most important routes. It was a blunt instrument that caused real damage on both sides, but it worked, in the sense that the English merchant fleet did grow substantially over the decades following the Acts, and English sailors did accumulate the deep water experience that had previously been largely a Dutch preserve. By the late 17th century, England was building a merchant marine that, while not yet matching the Dutch in scale or efficiency, was no longer the clearly inferior thing it had been in 1650. The English East India Company's evolution over the 17th century tells part of this story. Founded in 1600, 2 years before the VOC, it started, with less capital, less political support, and less organisational sophistication than its Dutch rival. The VOC's decision to secure its position in the spice trade through violent monopoly enforcement, culminating in the Amboina massacre of 1623, in which VOC officials tortured and executed a group of English merchants in the Spice Islands on charges of conspiracy that most historians consider fabricated, pushed the English company toward a different commercial strategy. Rather than competing directly with the Dutch for control of the Indonesian Spice Islands, the English company pivoted toward the Indian subcontinent, developing trading posts at Surat and Madras and Bombay that eventually became the foundations of the British Indian Empire. This pivot was, in retrospect, the better long-term strategy, though it took generations to become clear. India offered not just spices but cotton textiles, indigo, and a market for English goods of a scale that the Spice Islands never could have provided. The Indian trade required the development of a different set of commercial relationships, with Mughal merchants and local rulers, with Indian financiers and traders who had their own sophisticated commercial networks, that gave the English company a depth and flexibility that the VOC's monopoly model could not match. By the mid-18th century, when the Dutch commercial empire was in clear decline, the English East India Company was on the verge of becoming a territorial power in its own right. But in the 1660s and 1670s, none of this was obvious. What was obvious was the gap in sophistication between Dutch and English commercial institutions and the intense political pressure within England to do something about it. Samuel Pepys, who was Secretary to the Navy Board from 1673, was perhaps the single most important administrator in the English naval system of the period, understood this gap clearly. His diary, which is one of the most extraordinary documents of the 17th century, is full of observations about Dutch efficiency and English waste, about dockyards that were poorly managed, contractors who cheated the government, timber that rotted in the yards because the procurement system had broken down, ships that were understaffed because the navy had fallen behind on paying its sailors. His reforms, carried out over the 1670s with a meticulous attention to administrative detail that echoed his Dutch models, were genuine improvements that made the English navy progressively more effective. The intellectual fascination with the Dutch model extended beyond commerce and administration into politics and philosophy. John de Witt, the Dutch Grand Pensionary who dominated the Republic's politics from 1653 until his murder in 1672, was a figure of European-wide intellectual fame, a mathematician of some distinction, a political theorist of genuine depth, and a diplomat of exceptional skill. His political writings, and those of Peter de la Cour, circulated in England and influenced the political thought of figures like John Locke, whose ideas about constitutional government and property rights drew on Dutch republican theory in ways that Locke himself acknowledged. The intellectual traffic across the North Sea ran in both directions, but the Dutch contribution to 17th century English political and commercial thinking was substantial and largely unrecognised in popular historical memory. The religious dimension of the English relationship with the Dutch deserves acknowledgement as well, because it shaped the emotional texture of the rivalry in ways that are easy to miss if you focus exclusively on the commercial and military dimensions. Both nations were Protestant, and this shared Protestantism created a set of cultural affinities that coexisted uneasily with the commercial competition. English Puritans had found refuge in the Netherlands during the periods of Stuart religious persecution. The Pilgrim Fathers, before they became famous for sailing to New England in 1620, had spent years in Leiden, learning Dutch, working alongside Dutch craftsmen, imbibing something of the Dutch republican political culture before they decided that the Netherlands was too tolerant, too worldly, too commercially minded for the kind of godly community they wanted to build. The connection ran deeper than mere refuge. The English religious imagination of the 17th century was shaped by a sense of providential destiny. The belief, articulated by preachers and propagandists from the Elizabethan period onward, that England had a special role in God's plan, that the defeat of Catholic tyranny was England's appointed task, and that the Protestant God was an English God in some important sense. The Dutch shared something of this providential self-understanding. The story of Dutch independence from Spain was told as a story of divine deliverance, of a people whom God had preserved against all human probability. But the Dutch version was more mercantile, more pragmatic, less inclined to the cosmic drama that English Protestantism loved. This difference in religious temperament mapped onto the differences in commercial culture and naval style that we have already examined. The English tendency toward grand narrative and the Dutch tendency toward practical calculation. The 17th century's naval wars left their traces not only in the history books and the archives, but on the seabed, in the wrecks of hundreds of ships that never made it back to port, now lying in the grey silt of the North Sea and the English Channel, slowly giving up their secrets to marine archaeologists who have, over the past several decades, developed the techniques and the patience to read what the deep water has preserved. The Rooswijk, a VOC merchant ship that sank in 1740 on the Goodwin Sands off the coast of Kent, was excavated in a joint English-Dutch archaeological project in the early 21st century. She was carrying a cargo of silver coins, 500,000 guilders worth, destined for the VOC's trading operations in Asia. And the coins were still there when the archaeologists found her, scattered across the seabed in patterns that reflected the exact manner of her sinking, still legible as a moment of catastrophe 300 years after it happened. The cannon that had protected her cargo were still in place. The personal possessions of her crew, shoes, combs, a backgammon set, were preserved in the cold, low-oxygen environment of the deep silt with a fidelity that made them, as objects, more vivid and more present than anything in a museum display case. The Batavia, a VOC ship that wrecked off the coast of Australia in 1629 before she had even reached her destination, tells an even stranger story. She was carrying about 340 people, passengers, crew and soldiers, and her wreck on the Abrolhos Islands was followed by a mutiny and a series of murders that killed more than 100 people before a rescue party arrived months later. The ringleaders of the mutiny were tried on the beach beside the wreck, one of the few documented instances of a European court operating in Australian waters before the continent was settled, and two of the worst offenders were marooned on the Australian mainland, where they disappeared into history without further trace. The Batavia herself was excavated in the 1970s, and much of her hull is now on display in a museum in Fremantle, Western Australia, the oldest surviving example of a VOC vessel, a piece of the Dutch Golden Age that ended up on the other side of the world. The English ships lost in the Dutch Wars are less systematically studied but no less present. The Royal James, the English flagship sunk at the Battle of Solebay in 1672, went down in relatively shallow water off the Suffolk coast and was visited by salvagers almost immediately afterward, who stripped her guns and much of her upper structure. What remains is now protected as a scheduled monument under English heritage law, though the currents and the trawlers and the decades have taken their toll on what lies there. The Northumberland, lost in a storm off the Goodwin Sands in 1703 during the Great Storm that killed thousands across Britain and Northern Europe, has been partially surveyed and has yielded artefacts that speak of the daily reality of life in the late 17th century navy. Pewter dishes, navigational instruments, personal possessions of the kind that no officer expected to leave behind when he stepped aboard. These underwater sites have a quality that no archive can quite replicate. They are time capsules sealed at the moment of disaster, preserving not the curated records that people chose to keep, but the random, contingent reality of things as they actually were. A shoe found in the silt of the Rooswijk tells you something about the economics of VOC commerce, about the supply chains and the manufacturing standards and the purchasing priorities of a 17th century maritime trading company that a balance sheet cannot capture. A gun found on the Royal James tells you about the specifications of English naval ordnance in the 1660s, about the craftsmen who cast it and the regulations that governed its manufacture in a way that an Admiralty document can only approximate. The Dutch, characteristically, have been among the world's most systematic practitioners of maritime archaeology. The Netherlands has thousands of known shipwrecks in its coastal waters, many of them uncovered during the great land reclamation projects of the 20th century, when the Zuiderzee was drained to create new polderland, and the machines that dug the canals and levelled the reclaimed land occasionally uncovered ships that had been lying in what was once the sea for 300 or 400 years. The ships of the Fluit type, those revolutionary merchant vessels that had carried Dutch commercial dominance around the world, are represented in the Dutch archaeological record in reasonable numbers, and the study of their construction has confirmed and elaborated the documentary record of Dutch shipbuilding innovation in ways that specialists find endlessly interesting. There is something both melancholy and inspiring about the idea of all these ships lying in the cold, dark water, the Mary Rose and the Royal Charles and the Rooswijk and the Batavia and hundreds more, each one representing years of labour and thousands of skilled hands, each one carrying at the moment of its loss the hopes and the fears and the commercial calculations of a civilization. They went down in the service of purposes that seemed, at the time, obvious and important and urgent. The men aboard them were not thinking about history. They were thinking about the wind and the guns and the sea coming in through the holes in the hull. And yet what they built, and what they destroyed, and what they died for shaped the world we live in, its trade routes and its financial institutions, its maritime law and its naval traditions, its maps and its languages and its very sense of what the ocean means and what it is for. The rivalry between England and the Netherlands was not merely a historical episode, it was one of the generative conflicts of modernity, one of the crucibles in which the commercial, political and maritime institutions of the modern world were formed under the pressure of genuine, costly, blood-soaked competition. The sea keeps their secrets and slowly gives them back. The archaeologist brushes the silt from a pewter spoon and holds in her hands the evidence of a meal eaten 350 years ago on a ship that was about to sink. The coins from the Rooswijk are cleaned and catalogued, and the faces of the Dutch Republic's rulers, minted in silver by craftsmen long dead in a city that was once the centre of the world, emerge from the corrosion and look out at the 21st century with an expression of perpetual, unhurried confidence. The sea remembers, and in the remembering it keeps alive something essential about what these two nations were and what they made and why it still matters. One of the most striking and least discussed aspects of the Anglo-Dutch rivalry is the degree to which it was, at its deepest level, a competition in applied knowledge. The ships, the guns, the tactics, all of these were expressions of what each nation knew, and what each nation knew was the product of its investment in the systematic study of the natural world and the practical disciplines that grew from that study: navigation, cartography, meteorology, and the emerging natural philosophy that we would eventually call science. The Dutch Republic in the 17th century was one of the most scientifically fertile environments in the world. The universities at Leiden and Utrecht attracted scholars from across Europe. The relatively tolerant intellectual atmosphere of the Republic, again a product of its commercial need for openness, meant that ideas which would have been suppressed elsewhere could be published and discussed in Amsterdam or Leiden without the kind of ecclesiastical oversight that made intellectual life in France or Spain so constricted. Descartes spent 20 years in the Netherlands, writing the philosophical works that would reshape the European intellectual tradition. Baruch Spinoza, the lens grinder of Amsterdam, whose philosophical radicalism would eventually get him excommunicated from his own Jewish community, developed his ideas in the same city that published them. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, working in Delft with microscopes he had built himself from hand-ground lenses, became the first human being to observe bacteria, discovering literally a world invisible to the naked eye, a world whose existence nobody had previously suspected. For navigation, the key figures were men like the cartographer Joan Bleau, whose maps we have already mentioned, and Willem Bleau, his father, who had studied astronomy under Tycho Brahe and applied what he had learned to the production of charts and globes of unprecedented accuracy. The Dutch publishing industry, centred in Amsterdam, which was the largest publisher of printed materials in the world through most of the 17th century, produced navigational manuals, astronomical tables, pilot books, and atlases that were used by sailors of every nation because they were simply better than anything else available. The Wagenaar, named after Lucas Janszoon Wagenaar, who produced the first printed sea atlas in 1584, became so ubiquitous among English sailors that the word Wagenaar entered English maritime vocabulary as a generic term for any sea atlas, regardless of its origin. Longitude, the determination of east-west position at sea, was the great unsolved problem of 17th century navigation, and the failure to solve it cost a significant number of lives every year, as ships ran aground on coasts whose position their captains had miscalculated. The problem was well understood. Longitude requires knowing the exact time at your current location and comparing it to the known time at a reference meridian, which requires either a perfectly reliable clock or an alternative astronomical method. Neither was available in a reliable enough form for practical navigation at sea. The Dutch astronomer Christian Huygens, inventor of the pendulum clock, devoted considerable effort to this problem and developed marine chronometers that worked in calm conditions. At sea, in the pitching and rolling environment of a 17th century ship, his clocks did not keep adequate time, and the problem remained unsolved until John Harrison's work in the 18th century. But the effort and the sophistication of the scientific thinking it generated was itself significant, an expression of the Dutch capacity to bring theoretical knowledge to bear on practical problems with a directness that was characteristic of the commercial culture. The English response to Dutch navigational superiority was, appropriately, institutional. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, brought together the natural philosophers and practical craftsmen who might collectively solve the problems that individual genius had so far failed to crack. Samuel Pepys was a Fellow of the Royal Society, which is entirely characteristic of the way the 17th century's most capable administrators understood the relationship between scientific knowledge and practical power. The foundation of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich in 1675, with the explicit brief of solving the longitude problem by improving astronomical tables, was a direct government investment in navigational science that reflected the same logic. The first Astronomer Royal, John Flamsteed, spent decades producing the star catalogue that would eventually, through a tortuous series of scientific and personal disputes, contribute to the chronometric solution that Harrison achieved a century later. The Englishman who most completely embodied the connection between scientific thinking and naval practice in this period was not an admiral but a philosopher. Francis Bacon, writing in the early 17th century, had articulated a vision of natural philosophy as a practical enterprise, knowledge not pursued for its own sake, but for its usefulness in the management of the natural world, for the improvement of human life, for the extension of human power over nature. This Baconian vision, which shaped the programme of the Royal Society, was in some ways parallel to the Dutch commercial approach to knowledge. Both treated learning as a means to an end, both valued empirical observation over scholastic authority, both assumed that the world was comprehensible and improvable through systematic human effort. The sailors who implemented what these natural philosophers were learning were themselves a remarkable intellectual constituency. The navigation that a master of a ship needed to perform in the 17th century, taking celestial observations with a quadrant or a Davis backstaff, calculating latitude from the altitude, of the sun at noon, estimating longitude by dead reckoning from known speed and direction, correcting for magnetic variation and tidal current and the specific characteristics of a particular stretch of coast, required a level of mathematical competence that would have been considered impressive in a university scholar of the same period. The distinction between educated professional and uneducated craftsmen was not clearly drawn in the world of 17th century navigation. The best pilots were both, and the best naval officers were people who could understand what the pilots were doing and judge whether their calculations were sound. The Dutch navigational schools, formal institutions for the training of pilots and officers, produced graduates of a consistently high quality that was the envy of other nations. Samuel Pepys, characteristically, investigated these schools during his time as administrator of the English Navy and was impressed enough to advocate for something similar in England. The Trinity House pilots who guided ships into English harbours were skilled, but the systematic training of naval officers in navigation and seamanship that characterised Dutch practice was not matched in England until the 18th century, when the pressures of sustained global naval competition finally produced the institutional investment that the earlier period had lacked. The weather patterns of the North Sea, that cold, grey, unpredictable body of water that both nations had to master, were understood by Dutch sailors in a depth and detail that came from generations of intensive use. The seasonal wind patterns, the tidal rhythms, the fog conditions that would close the channel for days at a time, the particular viciousness of the North Sea in winter storms, all of this was mapped in the mental geography of experienced Dutch pilots with a precision that compensated partly for the limitations of the charts and instruments they had available. This experiential knowledge, passed down through families and guilds and harbour communities, was as important to practical navigation as any theoretical training, and it gave the Dutch a home water advantage that the English could never entirely neutralise. History tends to preserve the outcomes of battles and the reputations of the men who won them. It is considerably less good at preserving the actual experience of the battles themselves, what it felt and smelled and sounded like to be aboard a 17th century warship in a fleet action. That experience, which was the lived reality of all the men whose careers we have been following, deserves an attempt at reconstruction, imperfect as any reconstruction must be. A fleet action in the age of sail began with a period of manoeuvring that might last hours, the two fleets working to find the windward position, to form line, to deploy their forces in the configuration that would give them the best opportunity when the guns began to fire. For the men below decks during this period there was nothing to see and everything to imagine. The ship around them creaked and groaned with the particular voice of a vessel under sail, the masts straining against the force of the wind, the hull flexing as it moved through the seas, the ropes working in their blocks with a sound that those who have heard it describe as musical in calm weather and alarming in rough. The men who served the guns had cleared the decks during the night or the early morning, the cabin partitions knocked down, the officers' furniture carried to the hold, sand spread on the gun deck to give purchase underfoot and to absorb blood, the battle lanterns hung in the passageways to give some light in the gun deck's windowless dark. The guns themselves were run out through the open gun ports, the square holes cut in the ship's side through which the cannon projected their iron snouts toward the enemy. These gun ports, when open, admitted not just the guns, but daylight and air and, when the sea was rough, water. The lower gun deck nearest the waterline was the most dangerous position during a battle. The gun ports were only a few feet above the waterline when the ship was fully loaded, and if the ship heeled even slightly under sail, water could pour in through the ports before they could be closed. The Mary Rose had died this way, and the lesson had been imperfectly learned. Every gun captain on every lower deck knew, or should have known, that his ports were their own ship's vulnerability as much as they were its weapon. The first broadside, when it came, was something no description quite captures adequately. The simultaneous firing of 15 or 20 cannon on a single deck produced a noise described by every surviving account as unlike anything else. Not a loud bang, but a continuous crashing roar that could be felt through the bones of the ship and the bodies of the men that reverberated between the close walls of the gun deck and through the water and into the hulls of nearby ships. The gun deck filled instantly with thick, choking, sulphurous smoke. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. The men at the guns, each one with a specific role in the loading cycle, each one knowing by feel and muscle memory where to stand and what to do, worked by instinct and training and the barely visible signals of the gun captain, timing the sponging out of the hot barrel, the ramming home of the new powder charge and ball, the priming of the touch hole, the aiming that was more art than science, and the firing. All of this in the space of minutes, all of it in the darkness and the smoke and the noise. The physical experience of battle on the receiving end was equally far from any theoretical description. A cannonball hitting a wooden warship produced effects that the contemporary accounts describe with an explicitness that later, more polite historical writing has tended to soften. At close range, a 32-pound ball striking the side of a ship would penetrate the hull and emerge through the far side, carrying with it a spray of oak splinters that were in many respects more lethal than the ball itself. These splinters, jagged shards of dense hard wood, travelling at velocity, inflicted wounds that the surgeons of the period were often unable to treat successfully. The surgical log of a major fleet action records amputations, extractions of embedded splinters, treatment of blast injuries, and the management of burns from powder fires with a clinical matter-of-factness that tells you more about the experience of battle than any more emotionally engaged account could. The men who endured all of this were, in their way, remarkable. They were not volunteers in the modern sense. Press gangs were a routine feature of English naval recruitment, and the Dutch navies had their own methods of filling crews that were not always entirely voluntary, but they were, by and large, men who knew the sea, who had a professional pride in seamanship, who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. The Dutch sailors who served under de Ruyter were, by many contemporary accounts, among the most skilled and competent seamen in the world, men who had grown up in fishing villages and merchant ports, who had been at sea since childhood, who could read weather and handle sails and navigate coastal waters with an ease that came from absolute familiarity. Their counterparts in the English fleet were often equally capable, drawn from the fishing communities of Devon and Cornwall and the merchant ports of London and Bristol, trained in the same hard school of North Sea and Atlantic seamanship. What these men thought about the wars they were fighting, about the navigation acts and the VOC monopolies, and the competing dynastic interests that sent them to sea in fighting ships, we can only guess. They left fewer records than their commanders, and the records they did leave are filtered through the conventions of their time. But the memorial stones in the churches of Flushing and Horn and Plymouth and Chatham, the entries in the burial registers of the naval hospitals at Greenwich and Enkhuizen, the pension petitions filed by the widows of men killed in the 4 days' battle or the Medway raid, these fragments of documentation suggest, with quiet insistence, that the wars had costs that the treaty texts and the battle narratives do not record, costs paid in individual lives by individual human beings who had names and families and histories of their own that the larger story has mostly swallowed.